to change or refine. So my upcoming book that I'm referring to is called Chimurenga, Afrosonic Making of Zimbabwe, subtitled The Military Entertainment Complex. I look at the legacies of the liberation struggles and wars in our history, which were mobilized over time, including in the 1960s, Rhodesia. Those are weaponries. In the morning, I was talking about disarmament, that the colonial project centered disarming us. We never considered defeat. So Chimurenga has always been a project of rearmament. And so it is the legacy of that rearmament that was the foundation of Rhodesia post-1980. That's the story in that book. And one of the key workers and thinkers in that process were the institution builders like Yama Ponder. And so we are really, I'll give him the chance to fully introduce himself in his own words. Then I'll guide us on a path to explore the various facets of his work, what it meant to be an institution builder, a cultural technocrat at independence. Very, very important time in this kind of work. What lessons do we draw? Can we draw from that moment? Very exciting today. 1980, the 1970s, the most important historical point in our lives as a people. Most important event, that liberation struggle and independence. Nothing more important. We don't value that enough. Others who come after us will be telling themselves that. We better recognize the fact. But without us spending too much time on that one, let me give the mic to Amapondera to tell us a bit about himself in terms of his bio. Then we get to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Moje, for refusing to introduce me properly. My name is John Mapondera. I am a descendant. My grandfather, meaning the father of my father, was the last of the Zimbabwean warrior chiefs. He was described in British books as Paramount Chief Mapondera because he's the only one whom they did not defeat. He was fighting anti-imperialist wars between what is called Zimbabwe today and what is called Mozambique today. And as a result of which, the High Court building of this country is named after him. There is a museum in Maputo also named after him because of his escapades fighting Portuguese settlers in Mozambique. But ultimately, he had to, and this is a very interesting story. The last battle that he fought against a troop of British soldiers who were led by a man called Trooper Pasco. And I have an interesting story about Trooper Pasco. Was when they thought they had now ambushed him in Mazowe at night. They had seen a very big fire that was burning, and so they encircled the fire, believing that that was where Mapondera and his soldiers were warming themselves by the fire. When in fact Mapondera had left a big fire and had receded way behind. And of course, Trooper Pasco and his troop of soldiers, settler soldiers, advanced closer and closer to the fire, and they did not find anybody there. So they decided to occupy the fire. and fell asleep by the fire, hoping to pursue Mapondera the following morning. But Mapondera was watching all this, and he came and slaughtered all of them in the midst of the night. That was the last battle that he fought against the settlers. For that reason, because Trooper Pasco never returned to then Salisbury for a number of days, they then sent another posse in hot pursuit and found that Trooper Pasco had been, and his entire troop had been wiped out by a fire. And so they decided to come back to Fort Salisbury to report what they found, by which time Mapondera had decided to proceed to the Zambezi Valley, where he had intended to cross over to Barotsi land. Now it's very interesting to say this name Barotsi land. Here we call it Varoji. In Zambia they call it Barotsi. So he went to Barotsi land, where he said his brother Luanika was the chief there. But he found the Zambezi River in full flood, and he could not proceed. But as he was advancing towards the Zambezi River, my father's young brother was born on the way. And when he looked at this baby, he said he would not risk having this baby washed away in a river that was in flood, and he decided to return and face the whites. And this son was called Chandidzora, him who has made me to come back. That was my father's youngest brother. Upon his return, he was duly arrested and brought to Fort Salisbury, where he was imprisoned at what is called Josiah Tungogara, a corner of Josiah Tungogara and 2nd Street today. But he was a very proud man. He would not accept that any white man would rule over him or take his life. He decided to go on hunger strike, and he died from the hunger strike. But lo and behold, despite the fact that the man had died, he was still decapitated, and his head is one of those heads that lie on shelves in the British Museum in London, the subject of a very determined effort on our part to return the remains of such ancestors, as we hope it will happen sooner rather than later. So that is my pedigree, if you like, the pedigree of a fighter. So I've always known that you needed to fight for change if there was ever going to be any. My fights were institutional. I was perhaps the first Zimbabwean to work in the museums and monuments in the then Rhodesia. And I had one of the rare opportunities to be involved in excavating in my home area of Chiweshe, Mazoe, where Mapondera had been the paramount chief. We excavated a Catholic church in which 35 Portuguese had been buried in a fire when the church in which they were worshipping had been destroyed. So I had this unenviable position to have been one of the archaeologists to excavate that particular site,
All
which
right.
is called Tambatsoko.
All right. So let's then do it this way, because this is where I want us to have an exchange. This is an intergenerational exchange. Incidentally, Tirwazukuru, we are grandsons or grandchildren or great-grandchildren also of these ancestors that we're talking about. In terms of Guru Chwashira, as I said earlier. So this conversation, I think, is very, very significant. And so thank you, Mama Pondera, for introducing yourself. I would like to follow some kind of pattern where I'll be posing questions and you'll be responding to these. Then we're going to open the conversation towards the end so that we can also engage with him. He has a wealth of knowledge, as he has indicated to us here. So just to give you a very quick rundown, he worked with the museums and monuments back then. At Independence, was involved in the transformation of the Rhodesia Arts Foundation into the National Arts Council of Zimbabwe. So he was at the center of those processes. I said he was a cultural technocrat. That's part of what I meant. He was also involved in the foundation and running and setting up of the National Dance Company. If we talk about returning and regenerating and some such other concepts, repatriation, this is really what it means culturally. So I'd like to hear from him later on how those processes really worked. One of the key productions that I was involved in making was the musical Mbuya Nehanda Mweya Chimurenga at Independence, which ran over those years. In terms of not just celebrating independence by centering these very same heroes of the front line in the 1890s, but in terms of actually producing independence. Independence is not something that came, it was produced, it was engineered. These are some of the engineers of that process. What was the idea of producing such musicals like Mbuya Nehanda, Mweya Chimurenga? We'll talk about all those and other things. And so because the question that I posed in the morning was that, what then are we going to learn from all this history? What does history matter? What is the value and purpose of history? Which is not the study of the past as we were lied to in primary school. History is the production of knowledge systems, epistemes, ways of knowing, is the production of the present. And so I would like to learn from people like him in order to look ahead to see what history can actually teach us. In making new blueprints for the future, repatriating our ancestors, but also a lot of the cultural capital that is still captured and incarcerated in the colonial spaces. So this is basically the framework, and so I would like to I'll be posing questions to him. It would have been nice to have 2 mics. But nonetheless, I'll be handing the mic back to him. So we have something like maybe 12 discussion points, maybe 11 discussion points. And so we're going to start from John Mapondera as a young man and ask him about his life, your experience, Mapondera, working for the Rhodesian Museums and Monuments. What was your experience? Well, this was part of the conversation that we were having there in terms of the meaning of the museum. Has it been constant? What was your experience in those years, in the 1960s?
Well, in the 1960s and before then, museums were places where you had geologists who would go out to look for various species of animals. So you would have in the drawers on shelves rows and rows and rows of different species of mice and other such animal species. And that is what informed how those ethnographers would also treat our material culture. There would be rows and rows of bows and arrows, rows and rows of pottery. As in terms of rows, there was no appreciation of the place of these objects in the context of the ethnography, the ethnology of the people who created and used them as part and parcel of their cultural experience. And this, in fact, is what I came across when I then went over to the United Kingdom to study anthropology and ethnology and museology. So I went very much deeper into it. And I worked at the British Museum, where today the remains of our ancestors are also kept in those rows where there's absolutely no appreciation of that. These were real people who lived and have a history about them.
So you are looking at this as a young man from a colonized society. This was your perspective,
Yes.
but that was not the perspective of the museum from the official point of view. Am I right?
That is correct. But what then I found much more deeply rooted in the ethnography of the colonial institutions in the United Kingdom itself, in Europe, they were the same. Yes. So you had in the United Kingdom two brothers, William Fagg and Bernard Fagg. They were all honored with OBEs for having collected what they called works of art from everywhere, would be put on shelves in rows, row after row of African masks, of African sculptures, and those that were dug up, like the Ife, they put in their rows, and to them, they were just looking at objects of art without seeking to understand what was the meaning of these objects. And that is where I came in, to challenge that approach to museology.
So were you challenging these ways from within the colonial institutions?
Absolutely. I was, I was the first African to work for the British Museum. I was a Zimbabwean Shona man. There was nothing about my culture that was portrayed, because we did not make objects of art as you'd find in West Africa or in the DRC Congo.
Those masks and things like that.
So because we did not create those masks, none of our material culture would ever be portrayed or exhibited in the museums. So my thesis was on how to transform that. And fortunately, I worked at the Pitt Rivers Museum. It established what became, which was separate from the British Museum. And the first exhibition that we put together addressed these fundamental issues of what is the context in which these material objects were created, and how did they function in the societies that created them. which therefore provided an opportunity for me to address the ethnography of Southern Africa, where we did not produce sculptures, but we had our own taken out. So we could no longer say, oh, the Bantu in Southern Africa are not as advanced as the Negroes in West Africa because they did not produce sculptures of bronze and so on. So we then had to go deeper into understanding how this material culture functioned within the society.
There's no tangible material remains and products was undermined in that way. You really did serious intervention there. But you also did contribute in another dimension connected with all this in terms of theater, in terms of living cultures, not in museums, but in public spaces, in cultural, ecological spaces. You were a young man coming from the African village. Was that background important in any way in the work that you did, and what did you do in these regards?
Okay, in the mid-70s, everywhere you went as a black person, you would be subjected to forms of institutional racism.
Mm-hmm.
And I was working at that time now at the museum museum in Liverpool. And there was an outbreak of racial riots in 1972.
The rivers of blood.
Yes.
Rhetoric.
Of Enoch Powell.
Uh-huh.
So I realized that us as Africans, or black people from the Caribbean, from Africa and elsewhere, did not have the institutions to develop and grow our cultural experiences. So I went into what was then the ghettos and organized people as communities to participate in creative activities on the street, because we had no theaters. So we moved onto the streets, and that abated the tension, the interracial tension, because the whites in those communities began to welcome the fact that the Africans, the Caribbeans that lived amongst them actually had a very, very thriving culture that they could share with them. This culture experience of the Africans through music and dance, and even some were artists who painted, the Caribbean steel drummers and so on. So I went to and I said that we were not organized, but we were going to become organized on the streets because we had no access to theaters. We were not professional enough, they thought, to have access to theaters. And for the first time, the Arts Council of Great Britain agreed to fund street theater.
Was this a new concept that you happened upon, or you had brought it from here?
Well, I grew up in the village. We had no theaters, we had no buildings. Our theaters were out in the open. And that is the concept I brought to the United Kingdom.
Uh-huh.
And people started coming to Liverpool to study street theater from what we were doing on the streets of Liverpool.
Are there any names that you can mention, people that you worked with in terms of teaching these deals and ideas and brokering cultural exchange? Any names?
Yes, you would have people like Olarotimi, a number of people came.
Nigeria.
Emmanuel Jegedu, who was an artist and a musician. They were a number.
Yeah. Were you from this experience, I mean, this is part of the experience of the diaspora, the meaning of the diaspora. This time, the Liberation War was being prosecuted, also in a different kind of diaspora, in exile, in the liberation, in the frontline states, but also in the communities here in Zimbabwe. Jimrenga of all kinds, cultural, military. Were you constituting particular blueprints with this work that we are conducting in the UK? Did you put these blueprints to work at all?
Well,
later on?
The thing is that I worked very closely with UNESCO. I would be invited to Paris, and I would be invited elsewhere in the United States, wherever the UNESCO were holding conferences that sought to address the issues that were of interest to me. I would be invited as one of the consultants. And I remember one of them was in Barbados in 1978, where we were discussing the very concept of the African origin of the people of the Caribbean and South America. So it was a big conference.
Mm-hmm.
And one professor from Haiti stood up, and in his paper, he said his ancestors had not come from West Africa, but they had come from Central Africa, and that they worshipped through a spirit called Varozi. Now, Zimbabweans know that Varozi means Varoji. Those are our cultural origins. The people who built the great Zimbabwe, the Monomtapa Empire, were the Varoji. And these people were stretching from here in the south to the northern trans. So this professor was speaking about this spirit of the Varozi. And it was fascinating because he actually located them right in the middle of Zimbabwe without realizing where this spirit of Varozi came from. And what was interesting was that for the first time, this Varozi now had an origin, had a location in history, where they could now come back to Africa and identify exactly where their ancestry had been taken from into slavery in the Caribbean.
Right. So this is work of community re-education and making those necessary connections. Remembering the dismembered, as Aikwe Ama would say, the dismembered continent, dismembered people, decapitated people. But the lessons of the street theater, are they factoring into what you would do? How did you then come to work in Zimbabwe at independence? In what capacities?
At independence, the independent government approached UNESCO to ask for consultants who would assist in the development of a new educational curricula, as well as to develop structures that would best end with the aspirations of an independent Zimbabwe. So we had something during, which was Pung.
About
that? Because really, during the colonial era, there was no recognition of the wealth, the great wealth. All the creativity was focused at the National Art Gallery here in the form of stone sculptures, which a man called Frank McEwen had been promoting. But there was really no effort to encourage in terms of dance and music, all the other forms of human endeavor that extolled the virtues of African creativity.
And your staging of that musical Was the first 1980 or 81?
1981.
And if I remember, you told me that the idea was to produce some kind of exuberance. Independence is exuberance.
Yes, I was able to draw on some of the people that I had worked with overseas. I had had also the privilege about African creativity. I had been part and parcel of the organizing committee for almost 4 years until the first act was then actually staged. So by which time I had made, so I was able to invite some of them to come to Zimbabwe and help us in the formation of the National Dance Company, which was a
I'll end by reinforcing that I think on Wednesday with speakers from Kenya, there. We talk about similar kinds of museums in the Mijikenda communities, but also in West Africa, because the museum can be a very misleading concept. The school in the 1980s also utilized the same idea. So there are models. Are there different models? This is part of the key question. Or are we imprisoned by a particular way of looking at the structure and say a museum is this kind of thing? Are we impoverishing ourselves by just thinking about these things that we inherited to the exclusion of other conceptions? And I'll end by posing this question to you. Is museuming, gallerying, and archiving the right way or right ways to go? Is there a relationship between exhibition and carcerality or imprisonment? That may actually be very disturbing if we think about it.
Well, I'm not completely abandoning my training as a museologist. All these institutions have their place, provided you are able to give them the right perspective. You do not want a situation in which a museum becomes so backward looking that it no longer has a life and cannot be a living institution. That is part and parcel of the dynamic process of social, economic, political transformation. So I would want to see our cultural institutions like the museums, the art galleries,
the
National Archives, and also the creative arts. The film industry is now playing a very interesting role here. We have got young filmmakers who have gone into that genre of artistic creativity. They must be able to be relevant to the transformation that is continuous in society.
All right. I will promise this time, this will be the last one. Because you was talking about Dambat Soko, I cut him off because I wanted to contextualize that. There's Dambat Soko, there is Dambarare, and we caught still. This is where some of these wars against the Portuguese were fought, and we captured these cannons. I mean, were they? If you go to Tshwane, Pretoria, you see them. We defeated them, we took these. We allowed the South African government to claim these. Now they are there. Part of our legacy, part of our heritage. But talk in a minute about Dambat Soko. Where are these remains of the Portuguese today? What is the story? What is the legacy of this Chimurenga? What is this spirit of Chimurenga going to teach us going forward? And we'll end there.
The Dambat Soko excavation or archaeological site is still there in Chiweshe, but the remains were taken to the museum here, Queen Victoria Museum in Harare.
What year was that?
That was in 1968.
Mm-hmm.
I will allow just 2 questions. Just 2 questions. Those who are Those who have questions, 2, raise your hands. The question.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Mapondera, for the narratives. And my question basically is on the last issue that Chikoero raised. And it is very clear, I think, even if you go to the British system, that interred human remains belong to the church, which is the spiritual realm. And when it comes to ours, then compartmentalized in the museum. And your experience at the British Museum, how much of their own were put in museums? My understanding being that probably they put other people in museums, and then
let's wait for the second question so that you
free to communities to express themselves and live with their artifacts or whatever spiritual objects that they were using, since they were not taken to a physical museum. And because these artifacts or material objects are living expressions, they were able to live with them every day, interact with them. And to me, I think there was no cultural disarmament because of that. While those that sculptures, Benin, they
Okay. The way I approached it was to assert that our cultures were as valid as the cultures of those people that were identified by their sculptures. We even went beyond the sculptures. We went beyond the masks, even in those West African communities. In our edition, we provided an in-depth analysis of how these societies were structured and how they functioned, and how these objects became an expression of the socio-religious structures of the people. That is what we were putting across. And in our case, we're looking at what is the material culture of a typical Shona homestead, which made it functional economically and socially. And that is what we were portraying, so that we would not allow somebody else to adjudge our cultures as being underdeveloped or uncivilized because we did not meet up to their specific understanding of what a culture that is functional and vibrant and dynamic is all about. And that is what we pushed across.
Well, thank you. Can you respond to this first question from Samanyanga?
I wanted to come to his question by saying that we need to be able to go deeper ourselves, first and foremost, and be able to say, what is the meaning of these historical figures, who's now those who are living? How do we reinterpret our own history and give them the reverence which they deserve? Been doing it for many, many centuries before then, because those heads represented victory for them. And so they had to take them as symbols of the way how they had vanquished these peoples in faraway countries.
Thank you. I mean, as you had, there are many significant questions to explore here, but the time will not allow us to keep on this. But thank you very much for your questions. Thanks, Mapondir, again. Yeah, your last words.
I'm very pleased to see that we have representatives of the UNESCO here. And I would want to just say to them that would want UNESCO to become much more engaged in the process of the reconstruction of our cultural history, but equally to support the creative arts, particularly here in Zimbabwe, where we are thriving to establish these culture houses everywhere in our rural centers, because that way we will be able to preserve our cultural history at source in the villages and not wait for people to go and pillage the villages and bring those treasures away from their communities to somewhere like Harare. So I hope this is a message which you can take back to Paris. Thank you.
All right. No, ndinotenda. Ndinotenda. Matai.
Thank you for that historical narration of the decapitation, distortion, and everything that have been happening evil to our people. Help me to give them a pam-pam before they step down. You can ululate, you can whistle, because that is being African, that is being us. Thank you very much. As they step down, I will call upon Motsane to step up and present her paper for the next 15 minutes. Please help me to welcome her as she